The morning light filtered through the small rectangular window of cell block D, casting pale gray bars across weathered face. He lay on the thin prison mattress, staring at the ceiling he'd studied for the past 18 years. Every crack, every water stain, every small imperfection had become intimately familiar, like the face of an old friend you see so often you forget to really look at it anymore. But today was different. Today allowed himself to truly feel the weight of what was coming. The official document sat folded on his metal desk, the one that changed everything. 20 days. That's all the time he had left on this earth. 20 rotations of this godforsaken planet, and then it would all end. The execution date stared at him like an accusation. November 15th, 6:00 p.m. Eastern Time. They were always precise about these things, thought bitterly. 20 days, 14 hours, and 37 minutes to be exact. He'd been counting down since the governor's office had officially his final appeal 3 weeks ago. Sat up slowly, his body moving with the stiffness of a man whose joints had spent nearly 2 decades in concrete and steel. 48 years old, though his reflection showed someone much older. Prison ages you in ways that have nothing to do with time. His hair had turned completely gray by his early 40s. Deep lines etched his face like a topographic map of suffering. His hands, once strong and capable, were now thin and from years of prison labor and the constant tension of survival. He walked to the small mirror bolted to the wall and barely recognized the man staring back. Who was now? Not the 30-year-old he'd been when they locked him away. Not the idealistic young man who'd believed in justice and the American legal system. That person had died slowly, piece by piece, over 18 years. This man, this hollow version, was someone else entirely. Someone who'd survived. Someone who'd learned that the world wasn't fair, that the justice system was broken, and that hope was a luxury the incarcerated couldn't afford. But was different from most inmates. He hadn't raged against the system or spent his decades filled with hate. Instead, he'd become something of a mentor in the prison. Younger inmates sought him out when they were struggling. He taught literacy classes, counseled desperate men, and somehow maintained a quiet dignity that even the guards respected. They left him mostly alone, which in prison was its own form of mercy. The morning bell clanged loudly, echoing through the concrete corridors. It was 6:00 a.m. wake-up time. Heard the familiar sounds of prison stirring to life, doors sliding open, boots on metal floors, the grinding of the lock system, and the cacophony of human voices mixing into a dull roar. He dressed in his standard-issue gray uniform and prepared for breakfast. The routine was everything in prison. The routine was what kept you sane. In the cafeteria, the energy felt different. Word had spread, as it always did in the close quarters of incarceration, that appeals had been exhausted. The inmates knew. Some avoided his eyes out of superstitious fear, as if proximity to a condemned man might transfer death's curse. Others stared openly, morbidly curious about what a man facing execution looked like. Did he seem different? Did he seem scared? Did he seem broken? Felt none of these things. He felt numb and hollow and tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. His closest friend inside these walls sat across from him at the metal table, had 15 more years on his sentence, and he'd become anchor to something resembling normalcy. They ate in silence for a few moments before spoke quietly, his deep voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. "You good, man?" asked, concern etched into every syllable. Nodded slowly. "I'm at peace," he said, and he meant it. After 18 years of fighting the system, filing appeals, holding onto false hope, he'd finally accepted the inevitable. Peace was what remained when hope died. That afternoon, Chaplain Roberts visited his cell. The chaplain was an elderly man in his 70s, with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades listening to humanity's worst stories. He'd visited regularly over the years, and while wasn't particularly religious, he appreciated the chaplain's genuine compassion in a place designed to strip away all humanity. "How are you holding up?" Roberts asked, settling onto the small stool in the cramped cell. 20 days, said simply. 20 days and I stop hurting. That's not a bad deal. The chaplain nodded thoughtfully. Is there anything I can help you with? Any last wishes? Any way I can make this easier? Was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his sister, who'd visited him faithfully every month for 18 years. He thought about his elderly mother, gone now for 3 years, who died believing in her son's innocence. He thought about the friends and family who'd slowly drifted away as the years accumulated, as hope dimmed, as prison became his permanent address rather than his temporary condition. But mostly, he thought about Buddy. Buddy was a German shepherd he'd adopted 3 years before his arrest. The dog had been abused, abandoned, and nearly dead when found him at an animal shelter. They'd saved each other in those 3 years, two broken creatures finding solace in each other's company. When was arrested, had taken Buddy in. The dog was old now, probably wouldn't live much longer, had never expected to see his pet again. Yes, said quietly, meeting the chaplain's eyes. There is one thing, one last wish. The chaplain leaned forward, his expression open and waiting. I want to see my dog one last time, said. His voice didn't shake, but something inside him did. It was the first time in weeks he'd allowed himself to express a desire, a want, a need. Before the end, I just want to see Buddy one more time. Chaplain Roberts's eyes glistened with tears. In 30 years of prison ministry, he'd heard thousands of last requests, but this one, this simple, heartbreaking request from a man facing death, struck him differently. It wasn't angry or bitter or demanding. It was just a man, facing the end of his life, asking for one moment of connection with the being who'd loved him unconditionally. Let me see what I can do, the chaplain said softly. That night lay in his cell, a fragile thing called hope beginning to kindle in his chest, something he'd thought was long dead. 20 days remained. But for the first time in months, those 20 days didn't feel like a countdown to nothing. They felt like time he could still use, time that mattered. He didn't know that his simple request would become a spark that would light fires throughout the entire criminal justice system. He didn't know that one photograph would change everything. He didn't know that his story would eventually free not just himself, but the truth. All knew as he fell asleep that night was that he might see Buddy again, and somehow that made everything different. Chaplain David Roberts sat in the waiting area outside Warden Hayes's office, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The request he was about to present felt both monumental and terrifyingly simple. He'd been the spiritual counselor at Greenfield Correctional Facility for 31 years, and in all that time, he'd never felt quite this nervous about approaching the warden. But then again, he'd never had to request something like this before. The secretary, a middle-aged woman named with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, looked up from her computer. "He'll see you now, Chaplain," she said with a sympathetic smile. She'd been working in the administrative offices for 12 years and understood the chaplain's role intimately. Warden James Hayes was a man in his mid-50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire career in law enforcement. His office reflected this: military-precise organization, framed certifications on the walls, a photograph of his family on the desk, a wife and 2 teenage children smiling from a vacation photo. The warden stood as the chaplain entered, extending his hand. "David, good to see you," Hayes said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit. What brings you to see me?" The chaplain took the offered seat and organized his thoughts carefully. "I've come on behalf of an inmate," Roberts began. "In Block D, his execution is scheduled for November 15th. The warden nodded, processing the name. "Yes, I'm familiar with the case. He's been a model prisoner from what I understand. No trouble, no disciplinary issues. Serves in the literacy program if I recall correctly." "That's correct," Roberts confirmed, relieved that the warden already had some positive context. "Is one of the most remarkable men I've encountered in 3 decades of ministry. He's helped countless inmates, mentored young men who were heading toward violence, and maintained his dignity throughout a system designed to strip it away. Hayes leaned back in his chair, waiting. He sensed the chaplain had more to say, and he'd learned that patients often yielded important information. Has made a request for his final days, Roberts continued. It's unusual, but I believe it's important, and I wanted to bring it to you personally. What kind of request? The warden asked, his tone neutral but curious. He wants to see his dog one last time, the chaplain said simply. Before his execution, he'd like to have a visitation with his dog. The animal is with his sister, who visits regularly. I believe this could be arranged with minimal security concerns. The warden was quiet for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out over the prison grounds, the high fences, the guard towers, the concrete expanse that housed over 3,000 human beings in various states of desperation and hopelessness. That's an unusual request, Hayes finally said, turning back to face the chaplain. Yes, Roberts agreed, but is an unusual man. Hayes returned to his desk and sat down, his expression thoughtful. I need to think about the implications here, David. You understand that, don't you? If I approve a visit from a dog, a pet, it sets a precedent. Every inmate facing execution will start requesting similar accommodations. We could have a situation where we're essentially running a zoo in here during inmates' final days. I don't believe that's necessarily true, Roberts countered respectfully. Most inmates won't make such requests, and even if they do, each request can be evaluated individually based on security concerns and the specific circumstances. Security, the warden repeated, standing again and packing the length of his office. That's my primary concern, David. We have procedures for a reason. A dog in the facility, I don't care how well trained, introduces variables we can't control. What if it becomes aggressive? What if it's used as a distraction for an escape attempt? What if there's an incident and the animal is injured or the inmate is injured, and suddenly we're dealing with lawsuits? The chaplain listened patiently, understanding these were legitimate concerns. But he also understood that concern could sometimes be an excuse for inaction, a way of avoiding the harder work of actual compassion. Warden Hayes, Roberts said carefully, I've worked in corrections for over 3 decades. I've watched thousands of men come through these gates. I've sat with men on their last nights alive, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that he's not trying to manipulate the system. He's not using his dog as cover for escape or violence. He's a man who's made peace with his fate, and he's asking for one moment of connection with something he loves before that fate is executed. Hayes stopped packing and looked directly at the chaplain. You believe in his innocence, don't you? The question caught Roberts off guard. I believe in his character. I believe in the man he's become. Whether or not he committed the crime he was convicted of, that's not my role to judge. But I do believe that the man sitting in cell block D right now is not a danger, and his final request is not unreasonable. The warden moved back to his desk and opened his computer, pulling up his file. His fingers scrolled through years of records, 18 years of prison documentation. The chaplain watched Hayes's face as he reviewed the information. 0 disciplinary infractions, perfect work record, positive evaluations from guards, multiple programs completed, literacy tutoring, psychological counseling services. He's been a model prisoner, Hayes murmured, reading aloud. Teaches literacy, mentors younger inmates, has positive relationships with correction staff. The warden looked up. You know what's interesting, David? In my 28 years of corrections work, I've learned that the most dangerous inmates are usually the ones trying to game the system. The ones making big requests, testing boundaries. The quiet ones, the ones like they're generally trustworthy. They've usually found a kind of peace. Roberts felt a small surge of hope in his chest. Here's what concerns me, though, Hayes continued. If I approve this, it's about the message I send to the rest of the prison population, to the public, to the State Corrections Board. I'm saying that even on death row, we consider the humanity of our prisoners. Some people will see that as weakness. Some will see it as compassion. Either way, it's a statement. The chaplain waited, sensing the warden was working through this aloud, processing not just the security and logistical concerns, but the deeper ethical implications. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "I'm going to approve this request," he said, "but we're going to do it carefully. We'll have extra security, no physical contact between the animal and other inmates, limited time and strict protocols. We'll search the dog for contraband, we'll have handlers present, everything by the book." "Thank you, Warden," Roberts said, genuine relief flooding his voice. "Don't thank me yet," Hayes said. "Contact his sister. Tell her we need to schedule the visit within the next 2 weeks. And David," the warden looked directly at the chaplain, "if this goes wrong in any way, if there's even a minor incident, this program ends immediately. Understood?" "Understood," the chaplain confirmed. As Robert stood to leave, Hayes called after him. "One more thing, David. Get me everything you can about's case. I want to understand who this man really is." The chaplain nodded and left the office, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. A small kindness, granted. But as he walked through the corridors toward the phone to contact, the chaplain had no idea that this one act of compassion would become the catalyst for something far larger, something that would shake the very foundation of the justice system itself. Sometimes, he thought, mercy changes everything. Sat in her modest 2-bedroom house in suburban Connecticut, her hands trembling as she held the phone. The voice on the other end belonged to Chaplain Roberts, and what he was saying seemed almost impossible. "Your brother has requested a visit with his dog," the chaplain was explaining, "and the warden has approved it. We'd like to schedule it for next Tuesday if that works for you." Felt tears forming before she could fully process the words. In 18 years of visiting her brother every single month without fail, she'd never seen him ask for anything. Had become a ghost of himself, present but diminished, accepting his fate with a resignation that broke her heart. But this request meant something. This meant he was still alive inside, still capable of wanting something, still human in ways the system tried to take away. "Yes," she said immediately. "Yes, of course, I'll bring Buddy. When should I be there?" After taking down the details, hung up and walked to the living room where Buddy lay on his favorite rug. The dog was old now, 13 years, which was ancient for a German shepherd. His muzzle was completely gray, his movements slower and more deliberate than they used to be. He'd lost weight over the years, and his once powerful frame was now lean, almost fragile. But his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, still held the gentle sweetness that had made fall in love with him all those years ago. "Oh, Buddy," whispered, kneeling beside the dog and stroking his graying head. We're finally going to see him again." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the rug, responding to her emotional energy even if he didn't understand the words. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold. Had barely slept the night before, and Buddy seemed to sense something momentous was happening. She dressed the dog carefully, brushing his gray coat until it shone as much as an old dog's coat could shine. She chose his favorite collar, the red one with small brass bells that had given him all those years ago, before everything changed. The drive to Greenfield Correctional Facility took 90 minutes. Hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and her mind raced with 1,000 emotions. What if Buddy didn't remember? What if 18 years had erased the bond between them? What if seeing each other made it worse, not better? But even as doubt crept in, she knew better. Dogs didn't forget. Buddy had mourned absence for years, lying by the door and whining. Only recently had he stopped looking for his old owner so intently. At the prison gate, identified herself and explained her visit. The guards had already been briefed. They directed her to a special visitation area, not the standard visiting room where inmates met with family, but a more private space typically reserved for legal consultations. The room was small, with concrete walls and a single table with 2 metal chairs. A guard stood just outside the door. Waited with Buddy, her heart thundering in her chest. The dog shifted nervously, picking up on her anxiety. Then the door opened. Stood there, shackled at the ankles and wrists, in his gray prison uniform. For a moment, no one moved. Brother and sister looked at each other across the space, 18 years of accumulated pain and longing passing silently between them. Then Buddy saw him. The old dog's body went rigid. His entire frame seemed to quiver with recognition. A sound came from deep in his chest, a whine that contained years of confusion and grief. Then, with surprising speed for an animal his age, Buddy lunged forward, straining against the leash. Released him. The dog crossed the room in seconds and dropped to his knees despite the chains, opening his arms. Buddy collided with him, and they went down together onto the cold concrete floor in a tangle of prison gray and gray dog fur. The sound made, it wasn't quite a cry, wasn't quite a laugh, was something primal and profound, the sound of a man meeting his own soul after years of separation. Buddy was licking his face, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end was shaking. Was holding the dog like he was afraid the dog would disappear, his face buried in Buddy's neck, his shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't contain. Watched, tears streaming down her own face, as the man who'd been imprisoned for 18 years and the dog who'd waited for 18 years found each other again. Time seemed to stop. The guard outside the door, a man named Officer, was watching through the small window in the door. He'd seen a lot in his 15 years of corrections work, but he'd never seen anything like this. Officer had a daughter, and that daughter had a dog. In that moment, he understood something profound about the man kneeling on the cold prison floor. Whoever was, whatever he'd done or hadn't done, he was a human being capable of profound love. Without thinking, Officer pulled out his phone and snapped a photograph through the window. It captured on his knees with Buddy in his arms, both of them in profile, the prisoner's face buried in the dog's fur, the dog's tail a blur of movement. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered emotion, the kind of image that couldn't be staged or manufactured. Didn't share it immediately. He stood there for a moment, looking at the image, understanding its power. Then, almost without conscious thought, he sent it to his girlfriend, Lisa, a reporter for the Hartford Tribune, with a simple message. Something people need to see. The visit lasted 45 minutes. For those 45 minutes, and Buddy existed in their own world. They didn't talk. There were no words adequate to the occasion. Held the dog, petted him, let the old animal lick his face, and simply breathed in the familiar scent of his companion. Buddy rested his head on shoulder, and they sat together on the cold floor, both shaking, both crying. Sat watching, her own tears falling silently. This was what mattered. This was what the system tried to erase, the capacity for love, for connection, for the kind of loyalty that transcended time and circumstances. By the time guards came to indicate the visit was ending, had said only a few things aloud. "I love you, boy, I love you. I'm sorry I had to leave you. I'm so sorry." Buddy didn't understand the words, but he understood the love behind them. That evening, Officer's girlfriend Lisa was working late at the newspaper office when her phone buzzed with the photograph. She opened it and her breath caught. She read the simple message. "Don't ask where this came from, but publish it." Lisa knew her boyfriend. He wouldn't send her something like this without a reason. She read about his case, pulled up the trial records, saw the execution date looming. Then she looked at the photograph again, that raw, unfiltered moment of connection. She made a decision. She wrote a headline. His last wish before execution was to see his dog, but what happened next changed everything. The article published at 11:47 p.m. that night on the Hartford Tribune's website. By 3:00 a.m., it had been shared 47,000 times. By dawn, it had been shared over 1 million times across social media. By noon, it was trending nationally. And something remarkable began to happen. People started asking questions, real questions, About his case, about whether the justice system had gotten it right. The photograph had opened a door that would eventually lead to truth, a truth that had been buried for 18 years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Dr. Sarah was drinking her third coffee of the morning when she stumbled across the viral photograph on her Twitter feed. She was a criminal justice researcher at Yale University, specializing in wrongful conviction cases, and something about the image stopped her cold. The raw emotion, the desperation, the profound love captured in a single frame, it compelled her to click through to the article. She read about his case, and then, almost mechanically, she began pulling up the trial records from 18 years ago. What started as casual curiosity quickly transformed into something else, professional concern. Had been convicted of armed robbery and aggravated assault in 2006. The case had seemed straightforward at the time. A convenience store robbery that went wrong, a clerk injured, a suspect apprehended nearby. But as Sarah scrolled through the digitized trial transcripts, inconsistencies began jumping out at her like warning lights. She opened a shared document and started noting anomalies. The main witness, Robert Fielding, had that he saw clearly in the store during the robbery. But the trial transcript noted that the store's security camera footage showed the interior of the store during the robbery, and it had been entered into evidence. Yet something was odd about the reference to this footage. The prosecutor mentioned it casually, almost dismissively, but there was no detailed analysis of what the footage actually showed. Sarah's pulse quickened. In her 20 years of studying criminal justice, she'd learned that what wasn't emphasized in a trial was often more important than what was. She reached out to her contact at the Innocence Project, a lawyer named Michael Torres who specialized in exoneration cases. "I'm looking at a case from 2006, she explained over the phone. "Connecticut. Wrongful conviction is my working hypothesis based on witness testimony inconsistencies and footage that seems to have been underutilized." Torres listened carefully. "Send me everything," he said. "This is exactly the kind of case we investigate." Within 72 hours, the Innocence Project had pulled together a team. Torres, along with 3 investigators and a forensic analyst named Dr. James Wu, began a methodical review of every document from the trial. What they discovered was staggering in its implications. First, the security footage from the store had never been carefully analyzed. The prosecutor had mentioned it as existing evidence but had never walked the jury through frame-by-frame analysis. Why? Because the footage didn't show committing the robbery, it showed someone else entirely. A shorter person, different build, different movements. Second, Robert Fielding's testimony had significant contradictions. In his initial police statement, Fielding had described the robber as having a distinctive tattoo on his right forearm. In court testimony, he claimed he saw no tattoo. When investigators checked the trial evidence file, they found photos of and had no tattoo on his right forearm. But in the police database, there was another man who had a matching tattoo, Daniel Cole, who had been arrested multiple times for robbery and assault. Third, DNA evidence from the scene had been collected, but apparently never subjected to modern analysis. There were blood samples from the clerk who'd been injured during the robbery. The trial record indicated this blood had been tested and matched, but the methodology used in 2006 was primitive compared to contemporary standards. Moreover, the chain of custody documentation was incomplete. Dr. James Wu, the forensic analyst, was particularly troubled by the DNA findings. This evidence should have been subjected to modern PCR analysis, he explained to Torres. The methodology they used in 2006 was reliable but not specific enough. With contemporary analysis, we might get results that could exonerate him or provide additional information. Torres made a crucial decision. They would contact the Connecticut Department of Public Safety and request the original evidence samples. The request stirred significant bureaucratic resistance. The case was 18 years old. The inmate was scheduled for execution in less than 2 weeks. The state didn't want complications, but Torres had something powerful in his arsenal: public pressure. The photograph of and Buddy had generated enormous media attention. Major news outlets were now covering the case. Legal experts were appearing on cable news questioning the original trial. Innocents, project supporters were flooding the Connecticut governor's office with requests for clemency. The state couldn't simply ignore a building groundswell of public concern. Meanwhile, Dr. Sarah had made another discovery. She tracked down Robert Fielding's current address in Montgomery, Alabama. Fielding was now a pastor at a small Baptist church, a man who'd apparently found religion and attempted to build a new life. Took a chance and called the church. When Fielding came on the line, she explained who she was and what she was investigating. There was a long silence on the other end. "I can't talk about this," Fielding finally said, his voice shaking. "Mr. Fielding," said carefully, "an innocent man may be executed in less than 2 weeks. Your testimony was a crucial part of his conviction, if there's any doubt in your mind." "I said I can't talk about it," Fielding interrupted, and he hung up. But something in his voice had changed. There had been fear there, and guilt. Sarah could hear both. She called back the next day. This time, Fielding didn't hang up immediately. Instead, he said quietly, "Call me tomorrow. I need to pray about this." The call came through at 8:00 a.m. the next morning. When Fielding spoke, his voice was hoarse, as if he'd been crying. "I lied," he said without preamble. "At the trial, I lied about who I saw in the store." Sarah's breath caught. "The man who committed the robbery was Daniel Cole," Fielding continued, the words tumbling out as if they'd been trapped in his chest for 18 years, poisoning him from the inside. "He was my childhood friend. We grew up together. When the robbery happened, I was there, not inside the store but nearby. I saw Daniel do it. But when the police came asking questions, Daniel begged me to cover for him. He said I wouldn't have to say much, just describe a man who looked different from him. He said nobody could prove it anyway. I was young, stupid, and scared. I thought I was helping a friend." "Why are you telling me this now?" Sarah asked. "Because I'm tired," Fielding said simply. "I've spent 18 years living a lie. I became a pastor trying to find forgiveness, but I never got it. Not from God, not from myself. And now they're going to execute an innocent man, and I can't carry that weight anymore. I can't meet my Maker with that on my soul." "We need you to testify," Sarah said urgently. "We need you to recant your testimony." "I know," Fielding said. "I'm ready. I'm prepared for what that means. I'll lose everything, my church probably, but that innocent man will get his life back. That's worth the price." Torres received Fielding's statement within 24 hours. He immediately filed a motion for emergency case review with the Connecticut Supreme Court. The motion contained multiple grounds for reconsideration: witness recantation, security footage that contradicted trial testimony, primitive DNA evidence that should be reanalyzed with modern techniques, and potential identification of the actual perpetrator. But there was something even more significant that had just been discovered by the Innocence Project's investigators. Daniel Cole had been arrested again in 2008, 2 years after his conviction, for another armed robbery. He was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a different facility, and most tellingly, he'd been arrested again in 2012 for armed robbery. His criminal pattern matched the crime had been convicted of. The same MO, the same method, the same violence. The Connecticut Supreme Court received the emergency motion on a Friday afternoon. The court had been that execution was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The justices, faced with this suddenly available evidence of potential innocence, had a choice to make. Justice, the senior justice, read through all the materials carefully. She looked at the security footage analysis. She reviewed Dr. Wu's preliminary DNA findings. She read Fielding's sworn recantation. She examined Daniel Cole's criminal record. "This is a case that demands our attention," she told her fellow justices. By Monday morning, the court had issued its decision. a stay of execution pending full review of the evidence. Sitting in his cell, didn't know yet that his life was about to change forever. But in courtrooms and law enforcement offices across Connecticut, the machinery of justice, flawed though it might be, was finally beginning to turn in the right direction. The photograph of a man and his dog had opened a door, and through that door, truth was beginning to flood in. Was in the prison library, shelving books for the literacy program, when officer found him. The guard's expression was unreadable, which was unusual. Normally had an easy demeanor, a casualness that came from years of comfortable routine. But today, his face carried something different, something charged with significance. Said, keeping his voice professional but low, "The warden wants to see you, now." Felt his stomach tighten. In 18 years, he'd learned to read the subtle signals of prison life. A summons to the warden's office at 2:00 p.m. on a Monday, 2 days before a scheduled execution, could only mean one of three things: complications with the execution itself, family emergency, or... He didn't let himself complete that thought. The walk to the administrative wing felt longer than remembered. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Had visited just last week. She was healthy. His mother was already gone, so what could this be about? Warden Hayes's secretary gestured him straight through. The warden sat behind his desk and immediately noticed something different about his expression. Hayes looked tired but also strangely energized, as if he hadn't slept but couldn't stop moving. "Sit down," Hayes said, and sat. For a long moment, the warden simply looked at him. Then Hayes turned his computer monitor slightly so could see the screen. "The Connecticut Supreme Court issued a stay of execution approximately 2 hours ago," Hayes said, his voice careful and measured. "Your execution, scheduled for tomorrow evening, is postponed pending review of new evidence in your case." The words didn't register. Stared at the screen without comprehension. His brain couldn't process the information. After 18 years of accepting death, after making peace with his fate, after lying awake last night saying goodbye to his life, he couldn't suddenly absorb the concept of reprieve. "I don't understand," heard himself say from very far away. Hayes explained about the viral photograph, the media attention, the Innocence Project's involvement, the security footage analysis, Robert Fielding's recantation, the DNA evidence. He spoke for several minutes and listened without emotion, as if hearing about someone else's life. "There are significant questions about your conviction," Hayes concluded. "Questions that deserve answers. The court agrees. You're not going to be executed tomorrow." Stood up abruptly, his metal chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked to the window and looked out over the prison yard. The same concrete, the same fences, the same sky. Everything was identical to moments before, and yet everything had changed. "I don't know how to feel," said quietly. "That's understandable," Hayes replied, and there was genuine compassion in his voice. Word spread through the prison with astonishing speed. By dinner time, everyone knew. The man on death row, the quiet one, the mentor, the one who'd made peace, had received a stay. In the cafeteria, inmates approached cautiously, as if his sudden reprieve had made him radioactive. Found him in the yard during recreation hour. His massive frame moved quickly, and he grabbed in a fierce embrace, lifting him off the ground. "I told you, man," said, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you I could feel it. You're getting out of here. You're actually getting out." "We don't know that yet," cautioned, but his voice lacked conviction. Hope was seeping into the cracks in his armor, no matter how hard he tried to keep it out. "Yes, we do," said firmly. "I've seen enough in these walls to know when karma shifts. Your karma just shifted, brother." That night lay in his cell unable to sleep, but unlike the previous nights, when insomnia was a companion to anxiety and acceptance of death, this insomnia felt different. His mind raced with possibilities he'd trained himself not to consider. What if he was truly innocent? What if the evidence proved it? What if he walked out of these gates a free man? The thought terrified him more than death. The next morning, the day his execution had been scheduled, was moved to a different cell in the administrative wing. The warden wanted him separated from general population for security reasons, given the unprecedented situation. Sat in the small cell and thought about what was happening at that exact moment in the execution chamber. The protocols would be proceeding. The equipment would be checked. The lethal injection would be prepared. But there would be no prisoner, no execution, no death. His sister called at 11:00 a.m. Her voice was fractured, barely holding together. She said, and then she couldn't speak for a moment, "Oh my God." "I know," he said softly. "I'm still trying to understand it." "The lawyer from the Innocence Project wants to meet with you," continued. "Michael Tors. He's coming to the prison tomorrow. They're talking about exoneration. They have a witness who's recanting. They have." "Slow down," said gently, though his own heart was pounding. "One step at a time." "I brought Buddy by the prison," said, and could hear tears in her voice. "I told him what happened. I swear that dog understood. He was so happy, he knew." Felt his own eyes fill with tears, something that hadn't happened in years. Emotions he'd suppressed were beginning to crack through the concrete walls he'd built inside himself. That evening, a small television was wheeled into cell. The news coverage was surreal. His face was everywhere. The photograph of him with Buddy was being replayed constantly. Legal experts were discussing his case. The media had dubbed it the Last Wish case. People were calling for a full investigation. There were protests outside the governor's mansion demanding his exoneration. A news anchor was speaking earnestly to the camera. And in a stunning development in what's being called the Last Wish case, evidence suggests that may be the victim of a profound miscarriage of justice. The Connecticut Supreme Court has ordered a complete review of the evidence. Legal experts are divided on whether this will lead to full exoneration or simply a new trial. But what's certain is that the case that seemed closed 18 years ago is now very much open. Watched himself on television, a man he barely recognized. A younger version of himself, arrested and traumatized from news footage from his original trial. An older version of himself holding his dog from the photograph that had changed everything. That night tried to sleep but couldn't. He lay in the darkness of the cell, and for the first time in 18 years he allowed himself to cry. Not the quiet, suppressed tears of a man preparing for death, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere primal inside him. 18 years of accumulated pain, injustice, loss, and hopelessness poured out of him. And underneath it all, something else, hope. It was a dangerous thing, hope. It could destroy you if you weren't careful, but found he couldn't suppress it anymore. Somewhere in the darkness, in the quiet of his cell, he whispered the words he'd been afraid to say for 18 years. "I might actually survive this." The next morning, Michael Tors arrived at the prison. A tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and an expression of determined compassion, he sat across from and laid out everything the Innocence Project had discovered. Security footage analysis, DNA evidence requiring modern testing, Robert Fielding's recantation, Daniel Cole's criminal pattern, hours of meticulous investigation. "You were convicted on the testimony of one eyewitness and circumstantial DNA evidence," Tors explained. "Evidence that we now know is questionable at best. The real evidence, the evidence that was there all along, points in a completely different direction." "What happens now?" asked. "Now," Tors said, "we fight to prove your innocence. And based on what I've seen, I genuinely believe we're going to win." For the first time in 18 years, allowed himself to believe it too. The courtroom of the Connecticut Superior Court was packed on a humid June morning, 6 months after his execution had been stayed. Every seat was filled. Media representatives lined the walls with cameras and recording equipment. The case that had begun with a viral photograph of a man and his dog had captured the nation's attention. And now, finally, the truth would be tested in the place where justice was supposed to matter most. sat at the defense table wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, one that had purchased specifically for the trial. His hair had been trimmed, his appearance cleaned up, but nothing could hide the lines etched into his face by 18 years of imprisonment. Michael Torres sat beside him, along with two other attorneys from the Innocence Project. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor, a different one from the original trial, since the original had retired years ago, looked visibly uncomfortable. Judge Elizabeth took the bench. She was a woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and a deep commitment to justice. She'd spent the previous months reviewing the case materials, and her expression suggested she'd already formed preliminary conclusions. "We are here in the matter of the state of Connecticut versus," Judge began formally. "New evidence has been presented that raises significant questions about the defendant's conviction. This court will examine that evidence carefully and determine whether it demonstrates sufficient grounds for exoneration. Mr. Torres, you may begin." Torres stood, and his first action was to present the security footage analysis. A technician wheeled in equipment and displayed the convenience store footage on large monitors. Frame by frame, Torres walked the court through the footage, highlighting the robber's distinctive movements, build, and clothing. Then he presented photographs from the time of arrest, photographs that made it clear was taller, broader in the shoulders, and moved differently than the person in the footage. "The evidence has been available for 18 years, Torres stated, his voice carrying controlled intensity. "But it was never properly analyzed during the original trial. The prosecution mentioned it as existing evidence, but never conducted the careful frame-by-frame analysis that would have immediately revealed that the person in this footage is not." The prosecutor objected, but Judge overruled him. "This evidence is directly relevant," she stated. Next came the DNA evidence. Dr. James Wu, the forensic analyst, about the blood samples collected from the crime scene. He explained the differences between the primitive DNA analysis techniques used in 2006 and the modern PCR methodology now available. "When we conducted modern analysis on the original blood samples," Dr. Wu explained, "we obtained a DNA profile that did not match. Instead, it matched Daniel Cole, who is currently incarcerated in Connecticut for multiple armed robberies with similar MOs to the crime in question." The prosecution's case was crumbling in real time. Then came Robert Fielding. The former witness walked into the courtroom looking diminished, carrying the weight of 18 years of guilt. He was sworn in, and Torres led him through his original testimony, the testimony that had helped convict. "And now," Torres asked carefully, "do you stand by that testimony?" Fielding's jaw clenched, his hands trembled. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No, I don't, I lied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically. "I lied because I was afraid," Fielding continued, his voice gaining strength. "The man who committed the robbery was Daniel Cole. He was my childhood friend. When the police questioned me, he begged me to protect him. I was young and stupid, and I provided a description that matched because Daniel told me to. I identified in the lineup because I was told to, and I under oath because I was too cowardly to tell the truth." "Why are you telling the truth now?" Torres asked. Fielding looked directly at. "Because I couldn't live with the lie anymore. Because an innocent man was going to die because of my cowardice. Because I became a pastor and I realized I couldn't meet my God with blood on my hands." The prosecutor's cross-examination was half-hearted. There was nothing to challenge. Fielding had recanted, and his recantation was buttressed by DNA evidence and security footage analysis. The prosecution called its own witnesses, the original investigators, the clerk who'd been injured in the robbery. But their testimony only reinforced the problems with the original case. Evidence had been mishandled. Procedures hadn't been followed properly. The investigation had been rushed to a conclusion rather than pursued methodically. By the end of the third day of testimony, the case against had essentially evaporated. Torres presented his closing argument with controlled passion. 18 years ago, was convicted primarily on the testimony of a single witness who has now admitted he lied. The security footage, physical evidence that was available from day one, contradicts that testimony. Modern DNA analysis exculpates him and implicates another man entirely. Everything we know suggests one simple truth: is innocent, and he has paid an unconscionable price for our justice system's failure. The prosecutor's closing argument was defensive and weak. There was no reasonable explanation for the evidence. There was no way to salvage the case. Judge called for a recess and indicated she would return with her ruling the following morning. That night couldn't eat, sat with him in the courthouse cafeteria, but they barely spoke. The possibility of freedom was so real, so tangible, that acknowledging it felt dangerous. What if the judge ruled against them? What if there was some procedural technicality that prevented exoneration? "You're innocent," said simply, squeezing his hand. "Everyone knows you're innocent. Even if the judge somehow rules against us, which she won't, the world knows the truth now." Nodded but didn't respond. He'd learned not to trust in the justice system. He'd learned that innocence wasn't always enough. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded. The media had sensed the direction things were heading. This was going to be news, big news. Judge took the bench and adjusted her glasses. She looked directly at. After careful review of all evidence presented in this hearing, this court finds that the defendant's conviction was based substantially on false testimony. New forensic evidence definitively exculpates the defendant and implicates another individual. The original trial procedures were inadequate and failed to properly examine evidence that contradicted the prosecution's theory. Therefore, this court hereby vacates the conviction on all charges and declares him exonerated. For a moment there was silence. Then the courtroom erupted. Lunged from her seat and wrapped her arms around, sobbing. Reporters were on their feet, phones out, transmitting the news to the world. Torres was hugging his legal team. In the back of the courtroom, a group of wrongful conviction advocates stood in solidarity, many of them crying. Stood, and his legs nearly gave out. Michael Torres caught him and held him steady. "You're free," Torres said simply. "You're free." Free, the word didn't quite compute. 18 years. 18 years of concrete and steel and the constant hum of desperation. 18 years of lost time, lost relationships, lost life. And now one word erased it all. Judge gavelled the proceeding to a close and walked out of the courthouse into sunlight that felt completely new. Reporters swarmed, but Torres guided him through, protecting him from the chaos. Outside at the bottom of the courthouse steps was waiting with Buddy. The old dog's tail began wagging the moment he saw. They collapsed together, man and dog reunited once more, but this time free. The photograph that circled the world showed on the courthouse steps, holding his dog, his face transformed by something that looked like resurrection. The caption read simply, "Exonerated." 18 years of injustice, erased in a single moment of truth. The apartment that had rented for was small and modest, on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone in New Haven. It had a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom. It felt impossibly large and terrifyingly empty. He stood in the middle of the living room on his first morning of freedom, unable to move. The silence was overwhelming. In prison, there was never silence, always the hum of machinery, the sound of guards, the murmur of hundreds of men existing in close quarters. Here, there was only quiet and space and the crushing weight of possibility. Buddy lay on his bed in the corner, his old body finally at rest. The dog had adjusted to the apartment better than had. For the first 2 nights couldn't sleep. He'd lie in the bed, a real bed with real sheets, not the thin prison mattress, and his body would tense, waiting for the 6:00 a.m. bell that would never come. His mind would race through scenarios. What if this was a mistake? What if they realized they'd made an error and came to take him back? Called every day. "You're having a normal reaction," she assured him. "The trauma doesn't just disappear because you're free." But wasn't sure it was normal. Nothing felt normal. The world had changed in 18 years. Technology was unrecognizable. The streets were different. Social interactions felt foreign and hostile. When he went to a grocery store during his first week out, the abundance of choices paralyzed him. He stood in front of the cereal aisle for 15 minutes, unable to decide. "It's okay," said gently, putting her hand on his shoulder. "You can just pick one. You can always come back and try another." But couldn't explain the deeper issue. Choice itself had become terrifying. For 18 years his choices had been removed. Now, suddenly, he had to make decisions about everything: what to eat, what to wear, what to do with his time. The freedom was suffocating. 3 weeks after his release, Michael Torres visited his apartment. He sat across from him in the modest living room and laid out a proposal. "There are people who want to hear your story," Torres explained. "Advocacy groups, universities, legal organizations. They want you to speak about your experience, about what happened to you, about the systemic failures that led to your wrongful conviction." His immediate instinct was to refuse. He wasn't ready. He wasn't healed. He didn't know how to be in public, how to speak, how to exist outside these four walls. "I'm not a speaker," said. "You don't have to be," Torres replied. "You just have to be honest. Your story, what you experienced, it has power. It can change things." Torres leaned forward. "There are other people in prison right now who are innocent, just like you were. Some of them will never have a dog lover with a camera to help them. Some of them will never get a retrial. But if we can change the system, if we can make sure that cases like yours are reviewed properly, that evidence is handled correctly, we could save lives. Your story could be the catalyst for that." Thought about, still in Greenfield serving his sentence. He thought about the dozens of men he'd met in prison who swore their innocence, who'd exhausted their appeals, who had no hope. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'll try." His first speaking engagement was at Yale Law School. Stood in front of 200 students, his hands shaking, his voice uncertain. He told them about his arrest, about his trial, about the testimony he now knew was false, about 18 years of accepting an injustice he didn't commit. But something happened as he spoke. The words began to flow more freely. The students leaned forward, listening intently. When he finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Students approached him afterward with tears in their eyes, telling him his story had changed their perspective on the justice system. It was the first time since his release that felt something close to purpose. Over the next months, he accepted more speaking engagements. He spoke at the University of Connecticut Law School. He spoke to judges and prosecutors. He spoke to advocacy groups and civil rights organizations. Each time he got more comfortable. Each time his story got sharper, more focused, more powerful. But the speaking engagements also triggered his trauma. After each event, would return to his apartment and struggle for hours or days. The memories would surface, the trial, the conviction, the years in his cell. He'd wake up in cold sweats. He'd have panic attacks in public spaces. Encouraged him to seek therapy, and eventually he did. Dr. Lisa Martinez was a trauma specialist who worked with wrongfully convicted individuals. In her office, finally began to process what had happened to him. They talked about PTSD. They talked about the specific trauma of wrongful conviction, the particular psychological damage of having the system itself betray you, of being condemned by society for something you didn't do. "Your brain survived by accepting the injustice," Dr. Martinez explained. "It was a protective mechanism. Now that you're free, your brain is processing what was actually done to you. That's why the emotions are so intense." 2 years after his release, Michael Torres brought a proposal. The state legislature wanted to pass a bill requiring comprehensive review of all felony convictions where new forensic evidence might be available. They wanted to name it the law. Was hesitant. He didn't want to be defined by his wrongful conviction, but Torres convinced him that this was larger than individual experience. This bill could help hundreds of people, Torres explained. Maybe thousands. It codifies the kind of review that saved your life. It makes it the law. Before the Connecticut legislature, he told his story, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a voice for change. He talked about the broken systems, the inadequate legal procedures, the importance of properly examining evidence. He spoke about Robert Fielding, about Daniel Cole, about the 18 years that could have been prevented with proper diligence. The law passed with bipartisan support. By year 3 of his freedom, had found a rhythm. He worked with the Innocence Project as a consultant, helping to identify cases that might warrant review. He continued speaking regularly. He'd started volunteering at a community center in New Haven, mentoring young men at risk of the criminal justice system. Watched her brother transform from a man broken by injustice into a man who'd turned his trauma into purpose. She'd bring Buddy to his speaking engagements, and people would always ask about the dog whose love had started the chain of events leading to freedom. One evening, sitting on the apartment's small balcony overlooking New Haven, reflected on his journey. 18 years of wrongful imprisonment, 3 years of struggling to reintegrate, countless moments of pain and doubt and fear, but also moments of redemption, of purpose, of using his suffering to help others. I never thought I'd feel this way, told, who sat beside him with Buddy between them. Free in a way that doesn't just mean out of prison, free in a way that means my life has meaning again. Squeezed his hand. You always had meaning, she said. You just had to remember it. Buddy's tail thumped against the wooden deck, as if in agreement. The old dog who'd started this entire journey with a simple request to see his owner one last time had lived long enough to witness resurrection. And in his own way, Buddy had healed too, reunited with the man he loved, finally able to rest knowing that was safe. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for Second Chances took place on a bright autumn morning in New Haven, 7 years after his exoneration. The nonprofit's headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse on Chapel Street, with large windows that let in natural light, and a spacious interior designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. Stood in the main hall, greeting the 200 people who'd come to celebrate the opening, formerly incarcerated individuals, their families, legal advocates, law enforcement representatives, media and community leaders. Some had traveled from across the country to be there. Some were people had helped. Others were people he hoped to help. At a small cushioned bed in the corner of the stage, Buddy rested peacefully. The dog was ancient now, 16 years old, which was extraordinary for a German shepherd. His coat was nearly white, his movements slow and deliberate, but his eyes remained bright, still carrying that gentle intelligence that had captured hearts in a viral photograph a decade ago. Buddy no longer walked the halls with, mostly he rested while his owner worked. But today, for this moment, they'd brought him out. It felt right. Governor stepped to the podium to officially open the nonprofit. 7 years ago, she began, walked out of a Connecticut prison after 18 years of wrongful imprisonment. Instead of seeking revenge or retreating from public life, he chose to transform his suffering into service. Second Chances represents what's possible when we acknowledge systemic failures and commit to fixing them. The governor looked directly at, "You've changed our state. You've changed our entire approach to criminal justice." As applause filled the room, Felt squeeze his hand from her position beside the stage. His sister had been his anchor through everything, his imprisonment, his exoneration, his reintegration, and now his advocacy work. She was part of everything he'd accomplished. The mission of Second Chances was comprehensive: legal assistance for wrongfully convicted individuals, mental health counseling for formerly incarcerated people, job training and placement services, housing assistance, and family reunification support. Had built a team of 30 people, lawyers, counselors, case managers, and support specialists, many of whom had experienced the criminal justice system themselves. "We understand what our clients are going through," explained to a group of donors during the opening reception. "Not just intellectually, but in our bones. We know the specific trauma of wrongful conviction. We know what it's like to lose 18 years. We know what it's like to be afraid in a grocery store because there are too many choices. We can meet people where they are because we've been there ourselves." One of the first cases Second Chances took involved a man named Old Friend from Greenfield Correctional Facility. Had been released after serving 19 years of a 25-year sentence for armed robbery. New evidence suggested his co-defendant had been the primary aggressor, and his role had been significantly overstated. With Second Chance's legal assistance, his conviction was being reviewed. When arrived at the nonprofit's offices, walking in on his own for the first time, stood and embraced him. Both men were crying. "I told you back in prison," said, his deep voice thick with emotion. "I told you that you were getting out, that your life would change, but I never imagined it would change like this. I never imagined you'd come back and help people like us." "We're helping each other," replied. "That's what this is about. That's what Second Chances means, that everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves a real life." Over the course of the first year of operation, Second Chances helped 18 people gain exoneration or case reviews. They provided legal representation to 42 formerly incarcerated individuals fighting for their rights. They placed 35 people in jobs. They provided counseling and support to over 100 families dealing with the aftermath of wrongful conviction or unjust incarceration. The organization's impact extended beyond individual cases. Began consulting with state legislatures across the country about criminal justice reform. He before Congress about the need for federal standards on evidence preservation and case review procedures. He worked with law schools to develop curricula on wrongful conviction investigation. He collaborated with police departments on best practices for eyewitness identification and evidence handling. His work earned recognition. In year 5 of the nonprofit, received the American Bar Association's Medal of Merit. At year 7, he was nominated for a Presidential Medal of Freedom. But the honor that meant the most to him came from the people he'd helped, the letters and messages from people who'd been exonerated, who'd rebuilt their lives, who'd found second chances because of Second Chances. On the 10th anniversary of his exoneration, sat in his office at the nonprofit and reflected on the journey. The walls were lined with photographs, him with its job placement ceremony, him speaking before a congressional committee, him at law school graduations where formerly incarcerated people had earned their legal degrees. And dominating one wall was the original viral photograph, and Buddy, reunited in the prison visitation room, the image that had changed everything. That photograph had become iconic. It appeared in textbooks on criminal justice reform. It was used in law school lectures about systemic failures. It was featured in documentaries about wrongful conviction. But what mattered most to was what it represented, the moment when humanity broke through a broken system. That evening stood before an auditorium of 500 people at a conference on criminal justice reform. The audience included judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, law enforcement officers, and advocates. Behind him, a large screen displayed images from Second Chances, the people they'd helped, the cases they'd won, the lives they'd changed. "When I walked out of prison," began, his voice steady and strong, "I was a ghost. I was a man who'd lost 18 years. I was angry, traumatized, and broken. I didn't know how to live in the world anymore. I didn't know how to trust anything, not people, not institutions, certainly not the justice system that had destroyed my life." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "But something happened," he continued. My dog, Buddy, became the instrument of my salvation. Not because Buddy could change the legal system, not because Buddy could reverse my conviction, but because Buddy's love was so pure, so unconditional, that it reminded me of something essential, that humanity still matters, That connection still matters. That love still matters. Walked across the stage, projecting images of the people's second chances had helped. Each face represented a story of injustice overcome. 7 years ago, I opened Second Chances with a simple belief that everyone deserves a second chance, not just legally but psychologically, socially, spiritually, that the system can be fixed, that people can be healed, that redemption is possible. He showed statistics, the number of exonerations achieved, the success rate of job placements, the improvement in mental health outcomes for clients, the decrease in recidivism among Second Chances clients compared to national averages. But more important than statistics, said, is this: we've proven that wrongfully convicted people can contribute to society. We've proven that formerly incarcerated people can become advocates for change. We've proven that trauma can be transformed into purpose. We've proven that the system is fixable if we're willing to do the work. After the presentation, returned to his office, where was waiting with Buddy. The old dog lifted his head as entered, his tail thumping slowly. He's tired, said. He's been a good boy today, but I think he needs rest. Knelt beside his dog and stroked his head gently. Buddy was failing. The veterinarian had told them this visit was likely one of the last times they'd bring him out for public events. The dog was 17 years old, ancient for his breed, and his body was shutting down. Thank you, whispered to the dog. Thank you for everything, for loving me when nobody else could, for starting this whole journey, for being here with me every step of the way. Buddy's tail thumped once more and realized that this was how his story had always been meant to end, not with exoneration, not with the nonprofit, but with this. A man and his dog, surrounded by the evidence of lives changed, sitting together in quiet companionship. The simple request to see his dog before execution had become a movement. 18 years of injustice had been transformed into 7 years of redemption and helping others. One man's trauma had become a blueprint for systemic change. And it had all started with love, the unconditional love of a dog for his owner, a love so powerful that it had cracked open an entire broken system and let justice, finally, pour through. Sat with Buddy as evening fell over New Haven, and he whispered a final truth. We did it, boy. We actually changed everything. The end.